The first image that still comes to me is the tree. Not standing upright the way a tree should, but torn sideways, its roots ripped from the ground like a giant hand had pulled it up by the spine. The earth underneath was dark and wet, tangled with roots as thick as my arms twisted together like old rope. A scrap of pink cloth clung to one of those roots, fluttering just a little in the humid air every time the breeze moved through. Something pale glimmered deeper in that hollow, catching stray shafts of afternoon light that filtered through the leaves above. Close by, resting in the dirt, lay a tiny, carved owl, its edges rough under the mud, its eyes gouged out in two careful circles. No one talked much at first. You could hear bugs humming in the brush and the soft tick of branches settling. Even now, when the wind gets up and the trees start to groan, I can feel the weight of that silence pressing in around us again. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that happened, our world was small and ordinary, and in its own way, pretty peaceful. Early June in Benton Shore has a particular feel to it. The air is warm but not yet heavy. The mornings smell like cut grass and damp pavement, and you can hear bass boats out on the lake before the sun has fully cleared the hills. My days then were predictable. I'd grab coffee from the same corner diner, listen to the clatter of plates and the low murmur of old-timers arguing about fishing levels, then drive the short loop of back roads to my office with the windows cracked to let in the sound of cicadas starting up in the trees. The town itself ran on small habits, the grocery store doors whooshing open and shut, the shuffle of feet at the post office, the dull ring of the gas station bell when someone pulled up to pump 3. Nothing in that rhythm suggested that anything out of the ordinary was coming. It was just a Midwestern town in early summer smelling faintly of gasoline, coffee, and mud. My brother fit into that rhythm like he'd been born for it. Daniel taught U.S. history at the local high school, and even if you'd never met him, you could spot him by the stack of papers under one arm and the worn leather satchel he'd had since college. He drove a dark blue SUV that always seemed to have a thin film of dust on it from the gravel roads outside town, and there were usually a few stray crayons and snack wrappers rolling around in the back from hauling his daughter around. After school, he'd stop by the house he shared with Megan and Chloe in a quiet cul-de-sac vinyl-sided 2 stories with a maple tree in the front yard and a flag that clicked softly against the pole whenever the wind picked up. When I think of him in those days, I see him in the soft yellow of a kitchen light. Shirt sleeves rolled up, his voice low and steady as he helped Chloe work through her math homework at the dining table while the smell of dinner drifted from the stove. The click of his pen, the occasional creak of a chair, the murmur of his voice, those were the sounds of our normal life. Megan brought another kind of color into that picture. Her floral shop on Main sat between a barber and a small law office, its big front window always fogged a little from the coolers inside. When you walked through the door, the air was thick with the scent of damp stems, soil, and whatever she'd been working on that morning. Sometimes roses, sometimes lilies, sometimes just bundles of greenery and twine. She was shorter than Daniel. Dark hair, usually tied back in a loose knot apron, speckled with water spots and green smears from snipped stems. In the evenings, she'd come home with bits of floral tape still stuck to her fingers, tracing lazy circles on the kitchen counter while she talked about wedding orders and funeral sprays. You could always tell when she'd had a long day. She'd kick off her shoes by the door, sigh that soft, tired sigh of someone who loves their work but feels it in their bones, and then sink into the couch, the faint smell of cold flowers and leaves still clinging to her clothes. Chloe was the bright streak in all of it. At 11, she had knobby knees, loose ponytails that never quite stayed in place, and a laugh that carried clear across a yard. She favored a pink zip-up jacket even when it was too warm for it. The cuffs darkened where she'd dragged her sleeves along playground rails and picnic tables. On the zipper, she kept a little squirrel keychain I'd bought her from a roadside gas station when she was younger. The metal had dulled, but the tiny tail still caught the light every time she fidgeted with it. She loved taking pictures of small things: bugs on the sidewalk, the pattern of bark on a tree, the way sunlight made dust drift through a bedroom window, and carried a compact camera tucked into the front pocket of her backpack. The click of that camera and the patter of her sneakers over concrete were sounds you could count on hearing every time you stepped into their driveway. I lived just a few blocks away in a one-story house with peeling trim and a porch swing that creaked when you sat on it. Most evenings I'd finish my paperwork at the office, then swing by Daniel's place on the way home, lured in by the glow of that kitchen window and the sound of voices drifting out when they left the screen door cracked. Inside, the air always had a mix of smells. Whatever was on the stove, a hint of Megan's flowers still clinging to her hair, and that slightly dusty scent of school books Daniel kept stacked on a sideboard. We'd sit around their battered oak table, the fan overhead ticking as it rotated, and talk about completely ordinary things: a student who'd surprised him, a customer who'd stiffed her on a bouquet, a game Chloe was playing on her tablet. Sometimes I'd stay late enough to hear the distant hum of the highway at night, a reminder that the world beyond our little town was still moving. Back then, nothing in those evenings hinted that anything in our routine would ever crack. The lake and the forest framed our lives like a painting hung just outside the window. On hot afternoons, you could smell the faint tang of outboard exhaust drifting up from the marinas, and at dusk, when the sun dropped low, the hills across the water turned the color of old copper. Beyond those hills lay the Mark Twain National Forest, miles and miles of trees, rocky trails, and little hollows where mist collected in the mornings. A lot of folks in Benton Shore thought of the forest as a kind of backyard, a place for fishing, hunting, or just letting the kids run around and come back smelling like smoke and dirt. Every so often you'd hear stories at the diner about someone getting turned around on a trail, or a search party going out for a hiker who'd stayed past dark. Those stories always ended with a chuckle and a shake of the head, a punchline about people underestimating the woods. They never felt like warnings, more like reminders that the forest was beautiful but not to be taken lightly. Daniel loved that forest in a way that went deeper than just weekend trips. As a history teacher, he had a way of tying everything back to the land, the people who lived here before us. The old trading paths, the homesteads that had sunk back into the soil. When he talked about the Ozarks, he didn't just mention trail names. He talked about the way fog sat in the valleys at dawn and how you could tell the weather by the way the leaves turned upward before a storm. He'd taken Megan and Chloe on short hikes before little afternoon outings where they'd come back with dirt on their shoes and photos of mushrooms and wildflowers. I remember him describing his favorite campsites, his voice low and steady hands moving in small circles as if he were drawing the map in the air, the faint smell of coffee or grilled chicken lingering in the room. To him, the forest wasn't something ominous. It was a place where he felt grounded, like he was standing in a story that started long before he was born. The idea for that early June camping weekend came together over a few simple conversations. School was almost out, and you could hear it in Daniel's voice. He was tired, but there was a lightness under the fatigue the way teachers sometimes sound when they can see the finish line. One evening I stopped by and found him at the kitchen table with a folded campground map, spread out the corners, weighted down by a salt shaker and a jar of Megan's floral pins. The late sun slanted through the blinds in faint gold stripes, and you could hear a lawnmower droning somewhere down the street. He told me he wanted to take Megan and Chloe out for a weekend near the lake, just far enough into the forest that you could hear the owls at night and see the stars properly. I remember the way Megan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, but smiling, the faint scent of carnations and greenery trailing after her, saying it would be nice to have a couple of days where no one called her about last-minute corsages. Chloe, barefoot on the cool tile, clapped her hands when he mentioned a playground and squirrels, the tiny keychain on her jacket jingling as she bounced. The week before the trip moved like any other, only with small additions if you knew where to look. Daniel picked up a new can of fuel for the camp stove and set it by the back door, its metal edge cold against his fingers when he nudged it with his foot. Megan brought home a bag of groceries with handwritten notes on the side, marshmallows circled twice, as if Chloe had insisted, and left the bag open on the counter so she could double-check her list after work, the plastic rustling softly when anyone brushed past. One evening, I helped Daniel haul their old tent out of the garage. It smelled faintly of canvas and dust, and when we unrolled it in the yard, dry grass clung to the seams from the last time they'd used it. We stood there as the sky dimmed from bright blue to a soft, bruised purple, listening to neighborhood sprinklers hiss on and off as he checked the poles and stakes. It felt like preparation for something simple and good, the way you get ready for a holiday meal or a family reunion. There were tiny moments barely noticeable then that tug a little harder on me now. One night as we stood in the driveway by his SUV, Daniel mentioned that the forecast hinted at storms later in the month. He said it casually, just a shrug and a half smile as he tested the latch on the cooler, the metal clinking softly. That particular weekend, though, was supposed to be clear and warm with cool nights under open skies. Megan laughed from the porch light, casting a gentle halo around her, and told him he worried too much about the weather. Chloe, sitting on the top step, traced circles on the concrete with a piece of chalk, leaving faint white rings that dusted her fingertips. The air smelled like charcoal from someone grilling a few houses down, and the cicadas had started their evening chorus in the trees. Nothing in that scene raised a red flag. It was just another summer night in Benton Shore. The morning they left, the light came early and clean the kind you only get before the heat settles in. I woke to the sound of an engine turning over somewhere down the block and the distant clack of a car door closing. When I stepped out onto my front porch, barefoot on the cool boards, I could see Daniel's SUV idling in his driveway. The exhaust drifted in a faint gray ribbon behind it, dissolving into the still pale air. Chloe was climbing into the back seat with her pink jacket tied around her waist, her camera strap slung crosswise over her chest, the little squirrel charm catching the first bits of sunlight. Megan moved in quick, efficient lines from house to car, the trunk thumping shut as she settled the last bag. Daniel spotted me, lifted his hand in a lazy wave, and I waved back, feeling the rough grain of the porch rail under my fingers. The only sounds were the low rumble of the engine, a dog barking 2 streets over, and the soft swish of tires when they finally rolled away. The rest of that weekend was for me uneventful in all the ways that matter. I ran a few errands in town, the grocery store cooler humming as I stood in line, the sharp chill of the freezer aisle wrapping around my arms when I reached in for a bag of ice. I watched a ball game with the volume low, the murmur of the announcers blending with the ceiling fan's steady whir. Sunday afternoon clouds built faintly along the horizon, but they never thickened into anything more than a light overcast, the sky turning the color of faded denim. I grilled a hamburger on my back patio, the smell of grease and lighter fluid curling into the air, and thought briefly that Daniel would probably be doing the same over a campfire smoke drifting up through tall trees instead of over a patchy backyard lawn. It was a passing thought, the kind you hold for a moment and then let go. That Sunday night, as the light drained slowly out of the street and the first porch lamps blinked on up and down the block, I set my phone screen side up on the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock each second, landing a little too clearly in the stillness. I rinsed a plate in the sink, the warm water running over my hands, and glanced at the dark screen once or twice, half expecting a picture from their trip or a short text saying they were back and tired. Outside, the air had settled into that heavy, windless calm you sometimes get before a change in weather, and the street beyond my front window looked almost too still, as if it were holding its breath. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as the hours slipped by and the phone stayed silent, a small, quiet weight settled in the room that I couldn't quite name. I didn't realize anything was wrong at first. It started as the kind of quiet that slips into a Sunday night without drawing attention to itself. I'd put away the last of the dishes and stepped out onto my back porch, letting the screen door ease shut behind me. The air was thick with that warm, early June heaviness, the kind that settles over the Ozarks when the sun is gone but the heat hasn't let go yet. A few insects buzzed around the porch light, and the boards under my bare feet still held a trace of the day's warmth. I remember standing there looking down the street toward my brother's house, expecting to see headlights turning the corner any minute. They'd said they'd be home that night. Not early, not late, just sometime before dark. That's the way Daniel always phrased it. When my phone buzzed on the table inside, I hurried in, wiping my hands on my shorts, as though that would make me ready for whatever I was about to read. But it was just a weather alert. Nothing new, nothing from them. I stood there a while, the pale blue glow of the phone lighting my face, and tapped the screen once or twice, as if refreshing it would bring a message into existence. Nothing came. I told myself it was normal. They were probably still packing up the campsite, shaking dirt out of sleeping bags, loading the cooler. There was no reason to assume anything else. Still, I checked again an hour later, then again after that. The house was too quiet, as if the air itself was waiting with me. Outside, cars passed every now and then, their headlights sweeping across my living room wall in long, slow arcs. I kept expecting one of those arcs to linger, the telltale sign of someone pulling into my driveway or the Harper's driveway down the street, but each pair of lights kept moving, fading into the dark. Around 10, I stepped outside again, the gravel cool under my soles. The neighborhood had settled into that deep stillness you only get in small towns at night. A dog barked once, then nothing except the steady hum of a distant air conditioner. I tried calling Daniel. Straight to voicemail. Megan's phone did the same. I walked back into my kitchen, trying not to let my breathing get too fast. "They're fine," I muttered out loud, the sound of my own voice startling in the empty room. I tried to picture their campfire still crackling. Chloe curled up in her sleeping bag, the forest quiet except for the sound of leaves rustling overhead. For a brief moment, that image soothed me. But like a thin piece of ice cracking underfoot, the comfort broke almost as soon as I held it. Near midnight, the air in my house felt too heavy to sit still in. I turned on the porch light and walked halfway down the block toward their driveway. There was no reason to go all the way, but I wanted to see for myself. Their house sat under the soft glow of a street lamp, the maple tree in their yard casting long shadows across the grass. Their driveway was empty. No headlights, no engine ticking as it cooled, no luggage on the porch waiting to be carried in. I lingered there longer than I should have, pretending I was just out stretching my legs. The air smelled faintly of lake water and asphalt cooling after a warm day. A moth bumped into the street lamp with a soft thud. Nothing else moved. I went home and lay on my couch, phone in hand, muting the television when every sound felt too loud. Around 2 a.m, I must have dozed off, though I don't remember falling asleep. What I remember is waking suddenly, my heart thumping, the kind of jolt you get when a dream ends sharply. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the cable box. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no messages. My throat felt tight. I sat there a while, listening to the faint pop of the house settling and the slow pulse of the refrigerator motor, trying to convince myself it was foolish to be scared. They'd gone camping dozens of times. Folks lose service out there all the time. But even in my own thoughts, the excuses were beginning to sound thin. When the first gray light of morning washed across my living room, I got up without really deciding to. The sunrise cast a faint pink line along the tops of the houses, catching on the dew that had formed along my porch rail. I called both of their numbers again, once, then twice more. Same result. The town felt unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Instead of the usual drone of trucks heading out early or the slap of a newspaper hitting someone's driveway, everything seemed muffled. I stood in my kitchen, coffee cooling untouched on the counter, and I felt something settle inside me, something I didn't want to name yet. At 7:30, with my hands shaking just slightly, I called the sheriff's office. I tried to keep my voice level, but I heard the quiver in it. The deputy on the line was calm, speaking in that steady, practiced tone they use with worried family members. He asked how long they'd been gone when I'd last heard from them, whether I'd checked with the campground directly. I told him everything I knew. There was a pause on the other end of the line, short but long enough for my stomach to tighten. Then he said he'd send someone to check the campground. He didn't sound alarmed, but he didn't sound casual either. The drive out to the sheriff's office felt longer than it should have. The asphalt still held traces of early sunlight, warming the car's interior with that faint, dusty smell. Old dashboards get over time. I kept glancing at my phone on the passenger seat, hoping it would light up. It stayed dark. When I reached the office, the building was quiet, its windows gleaming pale gold in the morning sun. I waited outside, leaning against my truck, the metal cool against my back. A delivery truck rumbled past on the main road, stirring up a little swirl of dust. Everything looked normal, too normal. 20 minutes later, a cruiser pulled out from behind the station, heading toward the forest. I watched it go until its lights were swallowed by a curve in the road. The deputy inside had given me a small nod when he passed one hand, lifting briefly from the wheel. That tiny gesture did something to me, made me feel suddenly cold, as if acknowledging my worry made it real. I stood there until the dust settled back onto the pavement. I drove back home but couldn't stay inside. The walls felt too close. I paced my front lawn, my shoes flattening the wet blades of grass, leaving dark green tracks behind me. Every so often I checked the street, half expecting to see them come around the bend, tired and apologetic, waving out the window. Instead, the only things moving were the shadows of tree branches swaying in the slight morning breeze. Around 9, my phone finally rang. I snatched it up so fast I nearly dropped it, but it wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Megan. It was the deputy. His voice had the same even tone as before, but something in the rhythm of his words made my chest tighten. He'd found their SUV at the campground. Locked. Parked neatly. Not abandoned, but not touched either. Not in the way you expect after a weekend trip. He said he was heading out to check the campsite next, and he'd call me again once he had more to report. He didn't say the words I feared, but he didn't need to. They hung there between us, unspoken, but understood. The rest of the morning is a blur. I remember sitting on my porch, elbows on my knees, staring at the tiny cracks in the sidewalk where weeds pushed through. A breeze picked up now and then, rustling the leaves on the maple trees that lined our street. A delivery van hissed to a stop a few houses down its brakes, letting out a long, tired sigh. Normal sounds. Everyday sounds. But underneath them, something felt wrong, as if the world had tilted a few degrees off-center, and no one else had noticed yet. I thought about their empty driveway. The soft clink of Megan's keys when she tossed them on the kitchen counter. The way Chloe always swung her backpack onto the banister after a trip, letting it thud against the wood. I thought of all the small, ordinary noises I expected to hear from that direction every Sunday night. Footsteps on the walkway, the low rumble of their garage door, the soft slam of their car doors closing. None of that had happened. By late morning, the sun had burned through most of the haze, and the heat settled in with a stubborn weight. I went inside and stood by the sink, running a hand along the cool metal edge. I kept thinking I'd hear a knock, anything, but the only sound was the distant buzz of a lawnmower starting up 2 streets over. Then around 11:15, the sound I'd been dreading rolled down the street, the slow grind of tires on pavement, the engine of a sheriff's cruiser idling low as it approached my house. It turned into my driveway with deliberate caution, like the driver already knew his presence would change the air. I stepped outside before he could knock. The deputy climbed out, closed the door gently, and took off his hat. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression steady but heavy, like he was choosing each word before letting it go. In that stillness, sun beating down wind, barely stirring the faint chirp of a bird somewhere above us, I knew the day had shifted and nothing about it would be ordinary again. The deputy didn't rush his words that morning, and somehow that made the fear settle deeper in my chest. He stood there in my driveway with his hat tucked against his ribs, the sunlight glinting off the cruiser behind him, and told me they'd found Daniel's SUV exactly where it shouldn't have been parked at the campground entrance, locked tight, untouched. No sign the family had ever returned to it. His voice stayed level, but the quiet between his sentences carried more weight than anything he said out loud. When he asked if I wanted to follow him out there, I didn't even think. I just nodded, grabbed my keys, and felt the cool metal bite into my palm as I locked my door behind me. The drive toward the forest felt different from every trip I'd taken down that winding route before. The sun was higher now, bright enough to lay sharp white lines across the hood of my truck. But the trees cast long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than usual, as if they knew something I didn't. The radio stayed off. All I could hear was the steady hum of the tires on asphalt and the faint rattle from the glove compartment when I hit a pothole. When we turned onto the gravel road leading toward Liberty Ridge Campground, dust billowed behind the cruiser, rising in slow, drifting clouds that hung in the still air. I kept my window cracked just enough to smell the dampness of the woods. It felt cooler out there, like the trees were swallowing the heat. When we reached the gate, a patrol SUV was already parked off to the side with its lights still pulsing, casting red and blue flashes onto the trunks of nearby oaks. A couple of rangers stood near a portable table where a map had been spread out, its corners pinned down with coffee mugs and a flashlight. The forest was waking up around us, birds calling from deep branches, insects buzzing low in the brush. But the people stood strangely still, speaking in low tones, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The moment I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunched under my boots, echoing just a little too loudly. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a late return or a miscommunication. This was bigger, much bigger. One of the deputies walked me toward the campground entrance, his steps slow measured. Daniel's SUV sat there exactly as the deputy had described, parked neatly. Doors locked, windows clean, except for a thin glaze of dust from the previous day's breeze. Inside, I could see a bag of groceries still sitting upright in the back seat, a couple of Chloe's toys wedged near the cup holder, and their paperwork clipped to the visor. It looked like a family that had stepped away for a moment, not one that had vanished. My breath caught in my throat. The metal door handle felt cool and lifeless when I touched it. A ranger guided me toward the trail leading deeper into the campground. The air grew thicker the farther we walked, the shade swallowing the heat in pockets, leaving behind the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. When we reached the campsite, everything felt wrong in a way that didn't announce itself loudly. It was the kind of wrong that seeped into you slowly, the way a cold draft creeps under a door. Their tent was still standing, the front flap open, like someone had just stepped out to stretch their legs. A pot sat on the portable table, half full of pasta, now crusted around the edges. 2 plates rested beside it, each with a few bites missing. Water bottles rolled slightly when the breeze moved through the clearing. Their blankets lay inside the tent in loose piles, clothes scattered as though the family had been planning to settle in for the night. But there were things missing too. The backpacks, the first aid kit, the personal documents they always kept together in a waterproof bag. No sign of them, and there were no footprints leading away from the site. No drag marks, no sign of struggle, no overturned chairs. Just emptiness. A campsite frozen in place as if time itself had stopped mid-meal. A pair of search dogs arrived with their handlers a short while later. The dogs barked sharply at first, eager to be released, their collars jingling as they pulled against their leads. The handlers knelt, letting them sniff the clothing we'd provided, a sweater of Chloe's that still smelled faintly of her shampoo, a jacket of Daniel's that carried the familiar scent of school hallways and clean laundry. I stood back as the dogs lowered their noses to the ground and began to pull their bodies suddenly taut, their breaths short and focused. The handlers followed quickly, moving east into the forest, radio chatter crackling at their sides. For a brief moment, hope stirred in me, thin, fragile, but real. Maybe the dogs would find a trail. Maybe someone had just gotten turned around in the woods. Maybe they'd come stumbling back with stories about taking the wrong path or chasing something Chloe wanted to photograph. But within minutes, that hope dimmed. The forest swallowed the dogs' barks, muffling them until I could barely hear anything over the sounds of cicadas rising in a slow, relentless chorus. When the handlers returned, they looked puzzled. The dogs had followed a scent for a couple hundred yards before losing it abruptly, circling confused noses, working the air as if something had erased the trail entirely. The handlers exchanged glances, the kind of look trained people give when something doesn't line up with their expectations. They didn't say much, but they didn't need to. I could see it in their eyes. By midday, the search had grown. More cruisers arrived, their engines ticking as they cooled, and volunteers began showing up, locals with boots and backpacks, folks who knew the forest well enough to walk its trails blindfolded. Radios crackled constantly now, each transmission sharp in the heavy air. Maps were rolled out on the hoods of multiple trucks, markers tracing the ravines, footpaths, and rocky outcroppings beyond the campsite. The sun was high, bathing the clearing in a white, almost sterile light. I could smell sweat, sunscreen, and the faint scent of evergreen as people moved past me, preparing to fan out in organized lines. I stayed near the trailhead, watching as teams headed into the woods. Each group moved with purpose, boots thudding softly against the dirt brush, scraping against their pants as they disappeared into the dense foliage. I could hear their voices for a time, steady, methodical calling to each other now and then, but those sounds thinned out the farther they went. Soon only fragments drifted back to me, carried on the fitful breeze. A shout here, a rustle there, then nothing. Every once in a while, someone would radio in a possible lead, a shape in the distance, a scrap of fabric, a footprint that looked promising. Each time, deputies would walk briskly toward the site, voices clipped tension, sharpening their movements. I'd wait, breath tight in my chest, hands tucked into my armpits to steady the shaking. But each lead dissolved as quickly as it surfaced. The fabric belonged to another camper. The footprint was too large, too fresh. A noise someone swore sounded like a voice turned out to be the creak of wind through the pines. Rumors began to drift through the volunteers like smoke. Someone mentioned the possibility of a bear, though there were no signs of ransacking or feeding. Another muttered about a hidden ravine farther east, a place hikers sometimes avoided because the ground could crumble underfoot. One older man leaning on a walking stick whispered that the forest had a way of confusing even the most experienced outdoorsman, that the trees shifted in your vision when the light changed, making familiar trails look unfamiliar. Nobody said these theories aloud too loudly, but I heard them in passing as people brushed by me, and each one planted a small seed of dread. Around mid-afternoon, a ranger approached me with a canteen, urging me to sip some water. His voice was soft, the kind used for bad news or worried relatives. I did as he asked, the metal of the canteen warm against my lips, the water tasting faintly metallic from the heat. He kept a hand on my shoulder for a second longer than necessary, the gesture gentle and steady. That small kindness nearly brought me to my knees. By late afternoon, the search team started coming back in clusters. Boots, dusty shirts sticking to their backs, eyes tired and resigned. They shook their heads quietly as they approached the command area. A few leaned against trees, catching their breath. Others stared at the maps again, tracing the same routes they'd just walked, as if they could will the forest to give something up. The captain briefed the group in a low tone, his voice carrying the weight of both responsibility and frustration. They'd cover another set of trails before dusk, but each hour that passed made the air around us feel heavier. I watched as the sun dipped lower, turning the lattice of branches above us into a broken web of gold and shadow. The temperature dropped slightly, giving the woods that cool late-day chill that always comes before nightfall in the Ozarks. I wandered toward the edge of the clearing, feeling the rough bark of a tree beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something solid. Off in the distance, the forest stretched out endlessly, layer upon layer of branches and brush fading into the dimming light. I listened for anything, voices, dogs, even footsteps, but all I heard was the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under someone's boot. That thin fog of uncertainty hung over everything, thickening with each unanswered question. Just as the last of the day's light was slipping between the trees, a voice crackled over one of the radios, sharp, urgent, but not yet fully formed. A deputy near the command table straightened, pressing a hand to his earpiece. He glanced toward the Rangers, then toward me, his brow tightening as though he was trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. He signaled for the captain, lifting a hand slowly, almost reluctantly. Whatever he'd picked up wasn't clear yet, but it wasn't nothing. And as the captain stepped toward him, the forest around us seemed to pause, the air holding still, as if waiting for the next breath. The message over the radio that afternoon didn't come through clean. It broke apart once or twice, swallowed by static and the chatter of nearby units. But the tone was different, sharper, tighter. The captain lifted his head, brow tightening, and took a few slow steps toward the deputy who was pressing a hand to his earpiece. The rest of us paused mid-movement. Even the birds in the trees seemed to hold still. I couldn't hear the whole transmission, only the clipped edge of urgency and the deputy's quiet copy that. But when he turned and pointed toward the lakeside trail, something inside me sank a slow drop that felt like my stomach had slipped behind my ribs. I didn't know what they'd found. I only knew it wasn't nothing. A few searchers were called back from their grid lines, boots thudding hollowly on the dry soil. A ranger motioned for me to stay near the command area, but I found myself drifting forward anyway, drawn by instinct more than intention. The air shifted as we moved toward the shoreline cooler under the shade filled with the smell of wet earth and the faint tang of mud stirred by recent storms. Long strands of grass brushed my jeans as I walked, whispering against the fabric in the mild wind. The deeper we went, the darker the light became, the canopy overhead, tightening like a fist. We reached a narrow path that followed the edge of the lake, its surface dimpled by a light breeze. Ahead, through a screen of branches, I could make out a few figures standing near a fallen tree, an enormous oak that must have been torn loose during the storms earlier that summer. Its trunk lay angled across the ground roots, exposed in a wide, twisted burst of soil and stone. Even from a distance, something about the scene felt wrong. The deputies there weren't moving much. They stood in a half circle, not talking, not touching the tree, just staring into the hollow where the roots had torn free. Someone's voice called out, not loudly, not in alarm, but with the rough edge of someone who had run out of steady ways to deliver bad news. The captain lifted a hand, signaling everyone to slow down, and a second ranger stepped behind me, lightly gripping my arm. His touch wasn't forceful. It was the kind of quiet restraint you use when someone is standing too close to a ledge. All around me, the air felt thick, almost damp, like the woods were exhaling something old. When we finally reached the fallen oak, the smell hit first a mix of fresh earth root rot and the sourness of something that had been hidden away far too long. Sunlight pushed through the branches overhead in thin lines, illuminating little pockets of the root system, one patch at a time. The captain crouched near the hollow hands, braced on his knees, and leaned in just enough to see what the kayakers had stumbled across. His breath left him in a slow, heavy exhale. I moved closer despite myself. The ranger's hand hovered near my elbow but didn't stop me. The ground felt soft under my boots, giving slightly with each step, as if the earth hadn't settled yet from the storm's upheaval. And then, in the dim light beneath the roots, I saw it. Something pale, smooth, caught in a cage of tangled roots thick enough to wrap around a grown man's arm. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. A shape, then a curve. And then I saw the small scrap of bright fabric pink, muddied, clinging to a twisted root like it had once belonged to someone who loved that color. My knees almost gave out. I pressed a hand to the rough bark of the fallen trunk, the moss cool and damp under my palm. My breath wouldn't settle. Each inhale felt too shallow, each exhale too loud. The investigators didn't say anything for a long stretch of time. They didn't need to. The silence was its own confirmation. As more deputies arrived, the area shifted from a search zone to a crime scene with startling speed. Yellow tape unfurled around us, fluttering lightly in the breeze. Radios crackled with firm, clipped instructions. A forensics team was requested. The fallen oak became the center of everything, the place where the forest had held on to a secret the rest of us had been looking for since that June morning 4 years earlier. I wasn't allowed to move any closer, but from where I stood, the hollow under the roots was visible in fragments as the light shifted. A glimpse of bone here, the rounded edge of a skull there. 2 larger forms, one smaller. The roots had grown around them, curving between ribs and over limbs, holding them the way only time and nature can. It looked less like a burial and more like something the forest had tried to hide, tried to keep. The wind came up suddenly, carrying the smell of the lake water and wet soil across the clearing. I could feel grit on my lips, the faint taste of dirt. A deputy near me murmured something to the captain about calling the medical examiner's office in Jefferson City. Another suggested restricting access to the shoreline trail until they could get proper equipment in place. Their voices sounded distant, muffled, like I was hearing them through water. The captain eventually stepped toward me, his shadow falling across my boots. He didn't tell me everything at once. He didn't need to. I could see in his face what he wished he didn't have to say. When he did speak, his voice was low, deliberate. What they'd found was human. More than one. The smaller remains appeared to be a child. Identification would have to wait. He said protocol procedure, the long list of steps that keeps law enforcement steady when everything else feels like it's unraveling. I nodded, though it felt like my head weighed more than I could hold upright. My hands trembled against my sides. The air around me thickened, and it was as if every sound in the forest shrank away, until only my heartbeat remained. Hours passed while the forensics team documented every inch of the site. They moved slowly, almost reverently, brushing away dirt with gloved fingers, photographing each angle of the roots. The hollow grew wider as they cleared more soil, and with each inch revealed the truth pulled me deeper into itself. A tiny figure. 2 larger ones. Bits of clothing still clinging to the earth. And then brought out by a careful hand a small carved owl darkened by weather, its edges rough and uneven. I felt the world tilt. Chloe had always loved small things like that. By early evening, the remains had been removed one by one, each placed into separate bags, sealed and carried with quiet care to waiting vehicles. The woods felt heavier with each step they took. As the teams worked, a deputy stood near me in stoic silence. At one point, he offered me a bottle of water, and the plastic felt too cold in my hand. I took a sip anyway. The water tasted metallic, unfamiliar. The sun slid behind the hills, leaving the lakeshore in a muted gray. Portable lights were set up, washing the clearing in a harsh, sterile glow that contrasted sharply with the natural shadows of the forest. I watched as the last of the evidence was packed away, little fragments of what once had been my brother's family. Their story reduced to bags and tags and handwritten labels. I don't remember walking back up the trail. I only remember the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Somewhere behind me, a deputy was giving instructions into a radio. Ahead, the captain waited with his hands on his hips, shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. The medical examiner confirmed the identities later, first through dental records, then through the condition and size of the remains. Daniel, Megan, Chloe, all 3. Any hope I'd held on to, however thin, was gone. The cause of death for my brother was clear enough, a blow strong enough to fracture the skull. For Megan and Chloe, the bodies had deteriorated too much to give an exact answer, but the positioning and the depth of their burial left no doubt. Someone had killed them. Someone had placed them beneath that oak and left them for the forest to swallow. The sheriff's office took over with full authority, then issuing statements arranging transport, securing the area. Reporters began to appear at the edges of the blocked-off road. Flashbulbs blinked against the dark. Questions drifted through the air unanswered. Each noise seemed to bounce off the trees and fall flat. I stood beside my truck long after the last of the vehicles had pulled away. A thin line of moonlight traced the hood, turning the dust to silver. My hands rested on the doorframe, steadying me. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, slow and painful. A deputy stepped up behind me and asked if I wanted to follow them back to town. His voice was gentle warn. I didn't answer right away. I just stared out at the tree line, the faint glow of floodlights still visible through the branches. The forest, which once felt like a place my brother loved, now seemed like something else entirely, a presence that had kept a terrible secret far too long. Eventually, I slid into the driver's seat, shut the door, and sat in silence. The engine's low hum filled the cab as I followed the line of cruisers back toward Benton Shore. Headlights stretched ahead of us in a slow-moving ribbon reflecting off the glassy surface of the lake. Somewhere behind me, the woods settled back into darkness. When we reached the sheriff's office, the lights were already on, inside bright, harsh waiting. Deputies moved in and out of the building with files tucked under their arms, their boots tracking dust across the entryway. Through the glass, I saw a conference room being prepared. Chairs arranged microphones tested the sheriff himself standing stiffly near the podium. A long night lay ahead, and nothing about the world I knew or the family I loved would ever be the same again. In the hours after the remains were taken from the shoreline and the lights around the fallen oak were shut down, the world around me felt strangely thin, as if the air itself had been stretched too far. The sheriff's office filled with a low, steady murmur, boots on tile, quiet voices behind half-closed doors, the soft clack of keyboards as reports were started. I sat in a plastic chair outside an interview room, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. The overhead lights hummed with a faint electrical buzz, and every now and then a deputy would pass by with a clipboard or a radio, slowing just enough to acknowledge me with a gentle nod. No one asked me to recount anything right away. They could see the weight I was carrying even if I wasn't speaking. My parents arrived not long after sunset. My mother's footsteps were soft on the linoleum, almost hesitant, and when she reached me, she didn't say a word. She just lowered herself into the seat beside me and took my hand, her fingers trembling. My father stood behind us, one hand resting on the back of my chair, breathing in slow, deliberate pulls the way he always did when trying to hold himself together. The sheriff approached and spoke with them in a quiet, measured tone. I watched my mother's shoulders tighten as he explained the identification process and the steps that would follow. My father closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw working as though he were grinding back whatever sound was rising in his throat. Word spread through Benton Shore faster than I thought possible. The town had lived with the unanswered question for 4 years, and now the answer, awful, undeniable, seemed to settle over everyone like heavy fog. By morning, the florist shop where Megan had spent so many afternoons cutting stems and tying ribbons had a small bouquet taped to the front door. Daniel's school hung a banner with his name across the gym entrance, the edges fluttering in the breeze. Neighbors I hadn't seen since early summer stopped by my porch with casseroles and folded hands, unsure if food could do anything but needing to try. Their voices stayed hushed as if the sound of ordinary conversation might somehow disturb the grief hanging in the air. The sheriff's office moved swiftly once the remains were confirmed. Investigators returned to the forest the next few days, marking paths, measuring the root system of the fallen oak, and cataloging every item found in the hollow. The wooden owl, darkened and worn smooth in places, was sealed in its own evidence bag. Its presence felt like a message none of us were ready to interpret. When the deputies dug deeper into the past interviews, one name resurfaced: Amos Claiborne, the reclusive man who lived off-grid just a few miles from the trail lines. I remembered when his name first came up years earlier. Nothing concrete, then just a strange encounter and a few odd stories told by campers who crossed his path. This time, the evidence carried a heavier shadow. The sheriff obtained a warrant, and within a day investigators searched Claiborne's small wooden cabin tucked back among the pines. They found crude carvings, owls, birds, deer, each one marked by the same uneven blade strokes. Under a loose floorboard, they discovered a weathered notebook filled with scattered, disjointed passages. The entries mentioned a family, a child, and the woods in language that drifted between rambling and unsettling. Not a confession, but close enough that the air in the sheriff's office changed the moment the notebook arrived. I wasn't present when they brought him in, but I heard pieces of the interview afterward, how Amos spoke in short bursts, how he described giving a small carving to a laughing girl by a playground, how he mentioned voices in the forest, as though they were old companions. Detectives said he seemed to hover somewhere between reality and a world of his own making. His statements were confusing at times, chilling, but always vague. Even so, they were enough to move the case forward. The state psychiatrist declared him unable to stand trial in the traditional sense, and the court eventually placed him in a secure psychiatric facility. People in town had mixed reactions. Some felt a grim sense of closure, believing that even if he hadn't given every detail, his connection to the family's final days was enough to mark him responsible. Others whispered that he couldn't have acted alone, or that the forest itself hid more than he ever admitted. Benton Shore has always had a way of carrying its stories close to the bone, and this one lodged deeper than most. For my family, the verdict offered less resolution than the sheriff hoped it would. The law had its answer, but answers on paper don't quiet the ache in a parent's voice or the emptiness in a brother's chest. The months after the discovery felt like living inside a slowed-down version of the world. I'd walk to my truck in the mornings and pause without meaning to, staring down the street toward Daniel and Megan's house. Their porch light stayed on for a while after everything happened, left by neighbors who wanted to keep the place from falling into shadow. Eventually, the house was emptied, its rooms cleared with quiet reverence, each item handled as if it carried the warmth of the people who once used it. The for sale sign went up later that fall. I stopped driving past it after that. It was too strange seeing the windows dark. The forest changed for me as well. Before all this, those trails had been part of our lives: picnics, hikes, the occasional camping trip where the smell of wood smoke clung to our jackets. Afterward, I couldn't bring myself to step beneath those trees. The sound of leaves brushing together in the wind reminded me too much of the day we found them. That small scrap of pink fabric still flashes through my mind when the light hits certain angles at dusk. It's become a permanent imprint, something my memory refuses to loosen its grip on. There were moments, though, when the weight of everything felt less suffocating. A neighbor stopping by just to sit with me on the porch, no conversation necessary. A student of Daniel's writing a letter about how his stories had made history feel alive. A stranger sending a bouquet to my mother's door with a simple card that said, "We remember." Small gestures, but meaningful ones, threads that kept us from unraveling. With time, the shock softened into something quieter. Grief has its own rhythm. It settles into the body like a slow-moving tide. Some days I'd find myself standing in the aisle of the grocery store, staring at a shelf without noticing what I'd walked in for. Other days the memories came more gently: laughter from a summer barbecue, the smell of coffee in Daniel's kitchen, the squeak of Chloe's sneakers on his hardwood floors. Those moments hurt, but they also reminded me that their lives were full, not defined solely by how they ended. Even now, years later, I still think about the forest and the old oak that hid so much for so long. I think about how storms can reveal what human hands try to bury, how roots grow around secrets without ever meaning to. The truth we found there was devastating, but it was something we'd been living without for too long. Knowing, however painful, gave us a place to grieve, a place to bury our family properly, and a way to speak about them without the hollow ache of uncertainty. When I look back on all of it, the search, the years of silence, the discovery under that tangle of roots, I'm struck by how grief weaves itself into a person's life, becoming quieter, but never disappearing. I still carry the sound of that lake breeze the way it moved through the trees on the day everything changed. Sometimes it feels like the forest still whispers their names, not in fear, but in remembrance. And on certain evenings when the sky turns the same muted gold it did that last night, they were expected home. I stand on my porch and let the air settle around me. I close my eyes for a moment and picture them together, whole, unburdened by what came after. That image stays with me, steady and warm, cutting through the shadows that linger at the edges of memory. If you're still here with me, tell me where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.